As mentioned, I'm up at Simon Fraser University, which is close to Vancouver in British Columbia, Canada. And I'm mostly talking about a project that I've been working on for about the last year and a half that was funded by a group called the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, which is based out of the University of Victoria. But I want to do a little bit of background and introduce myself a little bit more fulsomely. So we have this thing on the West Coast here. It's kind of a bit of a joke, but kind of a real thing where people often ask young Indigenous folks who your mother is. In particular, on my mom's side, they're a matrilineal society, so everything flows through the mother's line, and so that it is a very common question: who is your mother? And a lot of context comes with the answer in terms of community and clan and crest and so on. A whole bunch of questions get answered by the simple response of saying Edna Bolton, for example, where I would say who my mom is. So I'm Nuu-chah-nulth and Tsimshian. On my father's side, I'm from the Ahousaht First Nation, which is located on the west coast of Vancouver Island in Clayoquot Sound. And I carry the name Cha-chim-mathni, which is from the House of Glockenspiel, which means whale fat, and I'm the son of Wiccaninish. As I mentioned on my mom's side, I'm Tsimshian. I'm from the Kitselas First Nation, which is about midway up the province, although pretty close to the Alaska Panhandle, on the Skeena River. And I carry two names in the House of Nis-Haiwas, or Waps Nis-Haiwas. Samoyigit Nisnaya, which is a name and a title, like a sub-chief in the traditional governance system of my mom's people, and then Gamayam, which is another name which roughly translates into imitating raven, and it comes from a story of the Kitselas First Nation and their migration to their current location. I'm married to Tsimshian, somewhere in between when I wrote this intro and this version of PowerPoint. It didn't like the font, the symbolics that I was trying to use there. Tsimshian, formerly Hilary Weetung from Curve Lake First Nation in Ontario. We live here in Vancouver with our two kids, Nuu-chah-nulth and Kitselas. Where I'm located, we are on the territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations, and neighboring to the Kitsumkalum and Nuu-chah-nulth First Nations as well. So, as mentioned, I'm an assistant professor in REM at SFU. I will be an associate professor in a few months. I suspect my tenure has been all but approved. I'm just waiting for the letter from the president. Okay, I literally just added this photo, like while you guys were doing the introductions to the slide. And this is just a friend of mine from a neighboring Tsimshian community, Dr. Spencer Greening. He brought down a whole bunch of seaweed, and my daughter had asked me, can I have a piece of seaweed? And it was just before dinner, and I said, sure, just one piece though. And as you can see there, it's a rather large piece of seaweed. They definitely love snacking on it. Okay, so in terms of where I'm situated, again, in what's often called the Pacific Northwest, or I guess in some ways the Pacific Southwest, if you're orienting from Canada. There's many different sort of expressions that people use to describe themselves. Saltwater people is one common term. This picture, for example, depicts something that is fairly uniquely Nuu-chah-nulth and also Makah and Ahousaht and a few of the tribes in Washington State were traditionally whaling peoples. Dr. Charlotte Cote at the University of Washington, in her book, says, I believe it's somewhere in the neighborhood of pretty close to 80% of traditional sustenance for Nuu-chah-nulth peoples was derived from traditional whale hunts. Of course, that changed quite significantly over the last 150 years or so. We're traditionally seagoing peoples. Josh Reed, who is also at the University of Washington, is quoting an Ahousaht chief here in his study of the macaw, where the chief says, "The sea is my country." This really strong affiliation with oceanscapes, seascapes, and what I've often called home waters, comparable to the notion of homelands. Another term that is often heard around various communities, particularly with respect to sea urchins and clams and mussels and such, is when the tide is out, the table is set. And I've got a picture here of one of our PhD candidates, Sky Augustine, who is from the Tsuminis First Nation or Chemainus First Nation on Vancouver Island, and she has done the bulk of her PhD research on clam gardens, ancient and contemporary clam gardens. Okay, so a lot of the research, going back to my master's and my early PhD work, really was trying to focus on the political economy of the Nuu-chah-nulth people. My training is in political science and Indigenous governance amongst the 3 degrees that I have. And one of the titles or subtitles of my PhD, my dissertation was from fishers to farmers of fish. And so there is a long history of contention in our communities around fisheries management, so engagement with the National Regulatory Board, as well as the incursion and the expansion of fish farms in British Columbia, and our relationships to these places and to these species, not only in a sort of more cultural sense, but also in terms of livelihoods. There's been tremendous impacts on the communities. We have gone, what I'm sort of alluding to in that title is we've gone from, sort of, I guess, fishing for thousands of years, to put it one way, to about the middle of the 20th century, when the Department of Fisheries and Oceans started to regulate more intensively and started to institute licensing regimes. My father remembers in the 1950s when the community that he's from was debating about, whether to sort of concede to the authority of DFO and the licensing regimes. He said they had this rather extensive debate, but at a certain point they had said it's only $1, and sort of the headache, they thought, well, it's only $1, but this sort of ushered in many ways sort of an acquiescence, if you will, to the authority of Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And then through his lifetime, he saw, what had normally occupied his community, especially the fishermen, for, what was the better part of, he talked about herring in the spring and all the way through to the late fall, essentially fishing 8, 9, 10 months of the year, to when I started fishing in the 80s and 90s as a teenager, really just a couple of months in the summer, and the same fishery even going further to times when there would be complete closures, or even just a couple of hours, really a couple of openings or a couple of weekends. It got quite bad, concern over the health stocks, particularly Pacific salmon. So a lot of my research I do tend to frame through a number of interconnected lenses, I call them, sort of looking at various issues, whether it's something like this, like fishing. I've done a lot of work on other industries such as forestry, mining, oil and gas extraction and transport. And I often look at these issues, like I said, from these interconnected lenses: Indigenous self-determination, environmental politics, settler colonialism, neoliberal capitalism, and more recently, a more sort of gendered, feminist, Indigenous feminist lens on these particular events. Usually they're things that come up in the news, a conflict, a protest over a pipeline, or a fish farm, or a blockade, or something such as that. And so I'm often looking at these from like I said, a political economy perspective, and as sort of evidenced by my intro, I'm quite critical of unrestrained capitalism, but certainly understand, like in my a lot of my aunts and uncles' times, the amount of clear engagement with markets and the commercial aspect of these industries. But like I said, my emphasis in terms of my critique is around sustainability and what happens when our resource extraction is unrestrained, which usually never usually ends well. So in terms of oil and gas, I come at this in Canada. The biggest concern right now is pipelines and oil and gas, or oil derived from diluted bitumen, the Athabasca oil sands in northern Alberta, northern Saskatchewan, and parts of the Northwest Territories. Obviously, the majority of the 20th century was driven by, in many ways, cheap oil. Oil sands, for those of you that know, is not cheap at all. Conservative commentator Ezra Levant once tried to brand Canadian oil as ethical oil, in contrast to what he called conflict oil, if you will, or a lot of the wars, invasions, a lot of the turmoil in the Middle East, over the last 30, 40 years. He was trying to contrast Canadian oil with that, and trying to brand it ethical oil. Actually, during the pandemic, there was a really interesting phenomenon. So, I mean, just to give you a bit of a sense, you can strip mine bitumen, or you can do hydraulic fracturing or fracking, which is a very water intensive process to extract bitumen. Like I said, it's a very expensive process. It's not like, I don't know, bursting out of these images that we might have of early or late 19th century water spouting out of these oil wells, or, rising to the surface. It's a really expensive endeavor. And I remember various figures being thrown around at different times about what the price of oil needed to be for the oil sands to be profitable. And I remember hearing $80, $75, $65, usually somewhere in that range. And during the pandemic, so I think it either late 2020 or early 2021, when demand dropped quite significantly, Western Canadian Select, which is how Canadian oil sands oil is traded on the commodities markets, dropped to about $5 a barrel, which absolutely does not make any money. And so there was a moment where I actually thought the market, if you will, was going to kill this industry, and then all the pipelines that have caused a fuss over the last few years. But alas, world conflicts and changing demands in the oil market have driven demand up again for oil, and so these pipelines are back on once I thought they were going to be killed by the market, so to speak. But there actually also was another news story at that time where there was a company that was paying people to take it away. So not even $5 a barrel, but we're like, literally, we will pay you to take it. And I just assume that this is a big part of this extractive and refining and transportation machinery that can't stop. It has to kind of keep moving, and so you can't have with demand dropping, you can't just stop it on a dime. It just has to keep going. And so they were literally paying people to take away free oil, or more than free oil at certain points during the pandemic. So I've written a fair bit about this, specifically about Indigenous ambivalence, and this relates to the changing livelihoods, subsistence, loss of many subsistence lifestyles. Commercial fishing, for example, is what I would call an adaptive lifestyle, where for the better part of the 20th century, Indigenous peoples participated in these commercial fisheries as individual boats and boat owners and families that would run these boats, or also have our members working in canneries on shore, or transporting, packing fish. There was a period of time where Nuu-chah-nulth people were participating. Almost everybody had some direct family member, whether aunts, uncles, cousins, parents, sisters, brothers. Somebody was working in the fishing industry. It had declined so much by the year 2002, however, where Nuu-chah-nulth, so the one example on my father's side, had over 200 commercial fishing vessels. We had dropped down to 6 commercial fishing vessels. And so we, within the span of a generation, if you will, from my father's time to my time, we dropped to where almost nobody was fishing anymore. And you had whole communities where there was certainly nobody fishing or involved in the fishing industry at all. So because I think of a loss of a lot of subsistence living or semi sort of adaptive market engagement, you have a lot of what I call indigenous ambivalence. You have people feeling torn about new extractive industries, about mining operations, about oil and gas transport. And you have the rise of something that Dana Scott, who's a professor at York University, calls contracting consent. And she talks specifically about the last 20 years of increased impact benefit agreements, where companies directly negotiate with First Nation communities to gain their consent for a project to go through. And so something like the oil sands and the Trans Mountain Pipeline have been a big deal because we're talking about extraction and transport from northern Alberta all the way down to southwestern British Columbia, and this impacting dozens and dozens of communities. And many have opposed it, many have supported it to varying degrees of some enthusiastically so, and some feeling like they were defeated, if you will, and just felt like they had to get the most out of it. So they signed an IBA so that they would have some sort of economic benefit. But a lot of this has impacted many of these sectors, like I said, forestry, fisheries, mining, and in the focus here on energy, oil and gas as well. So you do see Indigenous peoples, there's really no one uniform response to it. On the one hand, you have communities calling for ownership stakes in transport and refining of oil. And you have, like I said, ongoing resistance in other places. So a lot of my research has been looking at those particular dynamics. So as it relates to renewable energy and the future, if you will, this sort of decarbonizing future that, given the extremes of climate change have become more and more evident in our lifetimes here in British Columbia, for example. And I live on Simon Fraser University, just to give you an idea, is on a mountain, or it's not a very big mountain as far as BC goes, but it's about 1,200 feet. Still just enough to make your ears pop when you're driving up and down. But I've been living here since 2016, and I have noticed, even just in these last 8 years, significant differences in weather patterns. I also grew up in Vancouver, so as a kid in the 70s and 80s and 90s, the weather was quite different. It was notoriously gray and rainy. June wasn't necessarily a reliable time to plan weddings or such. But now, we're experiencing quite extreme weather patterns. The winter of 2016, 2017, my first winter here, we had a good 3 months of snow up on the mountain. And I mean like full on snow. Like the kids loved it in a way because they could go sledding, almost every day. And I didn't really mind the snow myself. But come 2021, we had a heat wave in this part of the world. And it hit 42 degrees. Sorry for the Celsius. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit, but it hit 42 degrees Celsius, at a time, where I'm accustomed to. I was surprised when it hit 25 in Vancouver. And it was that particular heat wave, which was June, it was right on my birthday. So it was like very end of June. And I remember, in the following weeks, it was revealed that well over 600 people in British Columbia died. It was by far the largest natural disaster, if you will, in our history in British Columbia. In the span of 3 days, more than 600 people died from heat exhaustion. But I was talking with a colleague who studies heat, and it was one of these things where it's not like it was a earthquake or a hurricane or tornado or something where you can really see the physical devastation of the earth. This was quietly hot, and people succumbing to heat exhaustion in their their 1960s apartment buildings with no fans or air conditioning. So it was a really bizarre sort of feeling that this was really quite significant. Obviously, we felt the immediate impacts of it, but the the extent, like I said, of the loss of human life was really something. So later that year, we had a atmospheric river, and this was the first time I'd heard the term atmospheric river, but we had a lot of rain, after a pretty sustained drought caused massive flooding. We have like one main highway. I mean, I think there are three highways that go from BC to Alberta, through various mountain passes, but the number one highway, or the Trans-Canada Highway in particular, was washed out due to flooding. And we were effectively cut off from the rest of the country for 3 weeks until the engineers and sort of disaster response people were able to reopen that highway. This was also in the middle of COVID, so there were issues around, trucks just couldn't get diverted across the border because of, various things around vaccination status. And so, like I said, we were effectively cut off from the rest of the country. And so, the idea of extreme weather events and climate change were certainly no longer hypothetical or at some point in the future. Certainly very tangible in impacting people's lives. So, we get the sense of urgency in terms of climate change. And there's a picture here I have of Melina Labucan Massimo. She's a Cree woman, climate activist. She owns a company that helps Indigenous communities convert to renewable energy. There is a nonprofit organization called Indigenous Clean Energy, and they do a lot of work in this area supporting advocacy and research. And it's safe to say that Indigenous peoples in Canada are a big part of renewable energy generation, from very small projects to even larger projects. And then, these include hydro, solar, wind, geothermal. On the hydro side, more of like micro hydro, or what we call run-of-the-river hydro projects. So projects that are not going to disrupt, spawning salmon and such. So there's this positive story, and one of the reasons I kind of got pulled into this was a lot of my other research is quite depressing. When looking at the demise of fisheries, looking at the impacts of unsustainable logging practices or fossil fuels. And honestly, a few of my grad students were like, we want to research positive stories. And so I had a number sort of drag me into this realm, looking a little bit more at exploring Indigenous clean energy. And so this is also, I think it was 2021 or perhaps 2022 when I remember it was in the pandemic, so it must have been 2021. I remember lying on my couch and thinking, why do we not hear more about electric vehicles on marine vessels? And I had probably just been reading some stories about Tesla or Chevy Bolts or whatever, electric cars. Every year the purchase of electric vehicles goes up, and so we, at least to my estimation, are pretty set on this trajectory. And having grown up, like I said, fishing on trawlers and seine boats and taking water taxis to and from my home communities, I was like, why do we not hear more about electric boats? Like, what's the deal? And so I sat up from my prone position and I started Googling, and I found an engineer at the University of Victoria named Zuman Dong. He's a mechanical engineer. And one of my colleagues here in REM, John Axon, who's done a lot of work on electric cars, specifically in light duty vehicles. This sort of began my research proposal writing at that point. And I was hooked because, the thing with electric vehicles that you often hear about or think about is the range, right? Or at least this is how I sort of interacted with the prospect of whether I was going to get one, and examining what the cost is and what's the footprint of making them, and should we just keep driving our existing gas car until it dies? Like, trying to figure out what the most responsible thing to do is. And so every time I run into an engineer that works in this area, I'm always asking what they think, and I get, every person I ask usually gives me kind of a different opinion. But the thing that really hooked me into this idea of research in this area was, you know what I mean? Like, new cars, like, okay, well, the range on this car is now 200 miles, or this one is now 300 miles or 150 miles. And the thing was when I found this article that Dr. Dong was highlighted in, he basically said your highway or your road is never the same. And so if you've ever been on the water, I guess for kelp culture folks, you guys have been on the water a whole bunch. You certainly know how true that is, and the different sort of environments that you're in. You have tides, 4 times a day, it's either going this way or that way. You have currents, you have wind. So, again, like I said, your road is never the same. It's always changing. So from an engineering point of view, I was just fascinated by this idea of how do you calculate range? And there have been a number of stories on the West Coast over the last 10 years, particularly amongst Indigenous communities, where a number of people lost their lives to boating accidents, and weather on the coast is no joke. And so there's an added element of safety around reliability. And so there was a whole bunch of things about it that I was fascinated by. um, you know and working with the team of engineers at UVic to try and figure out what is the best possible solution, um, and what's practical, and then obviously studying the different types of events, or sorry, different types of vessels that are being used by coastal communities. So we've partnered with the Nuu-chah-nulth Tribal Council, which is a group of 14 First Nations. Like I said, they are related to the Makah in northwestern Washington, as well as the Haida Nation. And there are two main communities up there in Haida Gwaii, Skidegate and Old Masset. And so essentially, the study in a nutshell looks at what are the existing fleet sort of uses, like, or what is the makeup of the fleet? What kind of boats do we have? What kind of fuel do they use? What is their use? Are they, displacement vessels like heavy duty fishing boats? Are they, vessels that skim along, high speed water taxis and such? And so what are their uses? What are the people's perceptions about changes in technology? Because the thing that I was reminded of is when I was on, my first boat was called Sea Fury. It was a 42-foot trawler. Those are the kind of boats with the big poles and the lines that go out. I probably traveled at about 6 knots, maybe 7. And it was probably, I don't know, 30, 40 years old by the time I got to it, and might have been on its second engine, third rebuilt engine. It's a really different kind of thing that we think about vehicles, where you might change them every few years or every 10 years or however long. You literally take out wooden panels and replace them with new ones, and you constantly maintain it. So it's a different kind of thing. And so we're really interested in what, in our communities, what their priorities are and how those might differ from the realm of passenger vehicles on land. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that we've been digging into in terms of surveys and focus groups, but also even expanding a little bit more in terms of Indigenous priorities about decarbonizing the marine space, what the benefits might be, what are the challenges in terms of policies or onshore charging infrastructure, or even just straight up use. So another example is that when I was on this trawler, the longest we were out one time, I think, was about 7 days. And you kind of go until the food runs out, or you fill up with fish, or the fuel runs out, and you come back in. And you just cannot do that with an electric vessel right now. There's no way it would work. So hybrid vessels, on the other hand, where you're using a hybrid motor of diesel and battery power, might be more practical, or the only practical solution in that particular case. Dr. Dong is also looking at hydrogen as a potential fuel source. So it really is kind of like I don't know if this is the right metaphor, but the Wild West of this industry. It's the early days, and so there's no standard, and there's nothing in mass production, and everything is really expensive to do. So, but we're interested, and like I said, from my perspective as a social scientist, what people think, and I start off even just like, so have you've heard of electric vehicles, for example, or electric trucks. What do you think about an electric boat or a hydrogen powered boat? And the funny thing with hydrogen, for example, is that everybody thinks the Hindenburg perhaps or something else, because I've had people make, like explosion sounds. People just think it's a really volatile fuel. And, from a chemical engineering perspective, I have no idea if it's any more or less volatile than, standard diesel or unleaded fuel. But John Axon and myself, like I said, as social scientists, are interested at the beginning of this shift to understanding what so there's no wrong answer, like what their thoughts are. What do you think about this? And then how can we utilize this study to create sort of more awareness and education about the possibilities of decarbonizing the marine space? And the last thing I want to mention here on this particular slide was, like I said, we're also interested in anything that's any sort of particularly cultural or indigenous worldviews on this space as it relates to other kinds of pollution, noise pollution, submarine pollution, cavitation, the types of engines that are running. We know from the pipeline impact assessment, for example, that what they call them southern resident orca whales here in this part of the world, particularly sensitive to increased tanker traffic and not only the traffic but the potential pollution from the fossil fuel spills, but like I said, also noise and I don't even know if I'm getting the right term, but like sonar, like the sound pollution in the marine space is impactful on our marine relatives. And so we also have those kinds of concerns, and we're interested in how those sorts of values might shape the marine decarbonization space in a different way than just straight up numbers and science and calculations and such. Yes, and like I said, I've already alluded to, there's tons of challenges and opportunities. Onshore charging, awareness, cost, there's all kinds of stuff to dig our teeth into with respect to this research. Okay, I wouldn't be who I am if I didn't look at the dark side of this. I'm working on a project, or I had worked on a book called Extractive Bargains with a political economist from the University of Northern BC and a political scientist from McMaster, Paul Bowles and Nathan Andrews. Edited this book called Extractive Bargains. And this was looking at, in many ways, our transition from fossil fuel to a post-carbon or renewable energy economy and all of the challenges with that. So British Columbia, for example, is like 95% renewable energy. We've been like this probably since the 60s or 70s, but it has come mostly in the form of large mega hydro projects. The WAC Bennett Dam, the Site C Dam right now, which is causing all kinds of concerns, flooding, traditional indigenous territories, methylmercury contamination, seismic issues that are happening right now in terms of Site C, all kinds of stuff. Mega hydro projects are not friendly to indigenous peoples or the land. Like I said, despite the fact that we have a significant amount of pride in having renewable energy already, versus our neighbor next door, Alberta, is still, I think, 75% dependent on fossil fuels. One of the things that Nathan and Paul did in one of their chapters of this book in particular was to look at Green New Deals, if you will. So like, I guess, taking the Democratic Party's Green New Deal and the plans of Ireland and France and Spain. They were looking at major Western economies and what would be the impacts, or what kind of critical minerals and metals are required to transition from what our fossil fuel economy to the post-carbon economy, to make all these electric vehicles, for all the infrastructure and so forth. And it's really actually quite frightening. There is a tsunami of more stuff that we need. And one of the most horrific things I did see was a bunch of stories on proposals to I think it's called like deep sea mining and looking for nodules or nodes. I can't remember what they call them, but like just wreaking havoc on the seafloor in terms of trying to again, get all the copper, magnesium. This picture here is of a lithium. I'm not sure if this is in Peru. There's a lot of concerns right now in Peru. So this also connects to the carbon colonialism issue. I think it's cobalt. There's something from the Congo. It's like 99% of the cobalt in the world is only you can get it from the Congo. there's all kinds of issues, and this is why I've called this sort of the mining renaissance, or the 21st century is the century of mining. And the concept of justifiable infringement. And the reason I bring this up in the context of Indigenous peoples is there have been a number of court cases, over Indigenous rights, and even the Trans Mountain Pipeline, for example. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said that this pipeline is in the national interest and it will get built. And I in one of my publications I said, when Indigenous people hear the term national interest, they recognize that their rights are going to be infringed. And I always tell my students, it's not without, it is within a particular ethical framework, call it utilitarian or whatever you will, the greatest good for the greatest number. These decisions are being made, and territories and people are going to be sacrificed. And so it's not like, there's a lack of awareness about it. It's not like necessarily people are ignorant, but they are making calculations, they are making decisions. And as it relates to Indigenous people and territories, we're often on the losing end of those calculations. So my concern with, this decarbonization of the economy in a big way, I recognize why we need to do it, but the stakes are higher. And so whereas Prime Minister Trudeau is talking about fossil fuel infrastructure and saying it's in the national interest, we're going to be shifting, again, like I said, all of this emphasis and resources towards mining extractivism and fitting out the new post-carbon economy. It's not just going to be the national interest, it's going to be like the global interest, if you will, or we're trying to save the planet. And there is no way we win that argument, or there's no way we sort of achieve environmental justice for Indigenous peoples when the stakes are that high. We are definitely going to be even more so those notions of sacrifice zones, environmental racism, and sacrifice people. So yeah, I mean, like I said, I recognize we need to go forward, and I'm trying not to end this on a total downer, but the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples talks about the concept of free, prior, and informed consent, which I think is vitally important. And if we're going to achieve reconciliation, or even sort of increase support for Indigenous self-determination, we have to be very real and understanding about the impacts of any kind of economy, especially one that, like I said, it's hard to a deeper investigation reveals really how much mineral extraction is going to be required to fuel these economies. But like I said, there's a certain feel-good aspect of it it's hard to contend with in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but all this other stuff going on. And then the last thing that I want to conclude with here is this idea of home. And it's just sort of a thread that I have in a lot of my research. I do research amongst Nuu-chah-nulth people and Tsimshian people, my own communities. And I've also worked for Indigenous communities, in sort of a research capacity, or in my prior life as a negotiator and administrator of negotiations with the state governments. And over 20, 30 years of working and then reflecting later on as an academic, I've come to realize that decisions that Indigenous communities make are with this concept of home in mind. And at times they're not always comprehensible to people from the outside that are thinking either about the immediate sort of urgency of a climate crisis, or the short term of, say, the market, for example. But many of these communities make decisions based on the fact that they have a home, and then they can't even conceive of another home. So just being temporally, the timeline goes much farther back and much farther forward. Um, um, and with that in mind, there's a scholar, I think he's at University of Michigan, named Kyle White, an Anishinaabe scholar. There's a writing that he has where he says, we're living through our ancestors' dystopia. And so it was in part responding to this sense of urgency that many non-Indigenous peoples feel about climate anxiety and the climate crisis right now. For many Indigenous communities, they've already lived through the apocalypse in some ways, in very real ways, not just metaphorically. And like I said, so they have a different sense of not that they don't recognize that these issues are urgent and ongoing and the need to protect their territories, but they have a longer temporal scale usually. And I think that's it. Yeah. So in my father's language, Kleko, Kleko, thank you very much. I've got my email and website there.